Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Him. And we are very happy to have Malesh Pai here. He will talk about optimal dynamic auctions.
So just before I start, thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure. Just one other note, this is the first time we're presenting this paper. It's still very raw. So other than your questions, we also invite your comments. Starting up, just think of this following problem, okay? So a monopolist airline has to kind of sell tickets for a flight. Buyers are arriving over time, so they don't all arrive at the same time. You can't conduct a classical auction. And the question is what is referred to in the operations literature as the single-leg multi-period revenue management problem, which is how should the airline sell these tickets to maximize expected revenue? Just to clear some thoughts, here's kind of our setup. There's a monopolist selling Q quantity, indivisible, identical units over T time periods. These time periods are indexed 1, 2, 3 through T. The buyers arrive over time, and the buyers have characteristics. This is a multidimensional type. So their characteristics are VI, which is the valuation that they place in getting the goods, QI, which is the quantity that they want, TI, which is the entry time of the buyer. It's the time the buyer enters the system. And overbar TI, which is basically the exit time of the system. The way you want to think about this is QI, let's say QI is 3, then the buyer wants 3 tickets. If VI is 1,000, he places $1,000 as his valuation for getting those 3 tickets. TI is the entry time. That's the time he learns about his... Just a second, something's gone badly wrong. That's the.
Can I ask one
yeah,
question? So
sure.
Was the VI the valuation for the 3 items or the 1 item?
For the 3 items. That's the important point.
And he would not be at all happy with 2 items. 2 items are worth
yes,
0.
that's true, but I'll get to that in a second. Okay. He would not, the idea is that if he asks for 3 items, 2 items is useless to him. 4 items gives no additional value to him. So we impose some restrictions, which I'll kind of justify in a second. The agent I can misreport VI any which way he wants. He can overreport his required quantity. He cannot enter early into the system. So if he's entering at time TI, he can only pretend he enters at some time T later than TI. All right? And similarly, we assume no late exit from the system. All these 4 characteristics are private information of the agent. So the auctioneer has to extract them from the agent. And the final assumption, which is standard to, or fairly standard to mechanism design literature, is that the agent types are identical, independent, identically distributed draws from a distribution F. This distribution F is over the full 4 components of his type. So we restrict our attention to direct revelation mechanisms. For those of you who are not in the know, a direct revelation mechanism is it's basically a mechanism where each agent reports his type through to the seller. As a function of the profile of realized types, the seller has an allocation rule which decides who gets the good. And as a function of the profile of reported types, the profile being everyone's types, the seller determines a payment for each agent, which is a payment rule. These allocation and payment rules are announced by the seller in advance, and he commits to them. The revelation lemma, or the revelation principle, which was kind of well known, basically says that in most settings we can restrict our attention to these mechanisms without any loss of generality. So if you can find any other mechanism that implements something, you can find a direct revelation mechanism that implements something. So we'll just restrict our attention to these. The goal of our talk is to find a direct revelation mechanism that maximizes the expected revenue for the seller. So this is subject to capacity constraints and feasibility. He can sell at most Q units, and he has to sell them by time t. Incentive compatibility, which simply says that each agent should reveal all 4 characteristics truthfully. And participation, which says that an agent's expected utility from announcing his true type should be non-negative. There's a little caveat, but we'll get around to that in a minute. I just want to take you back now to kind of my airline pricing story and tell you why this kind of fits the airline pricing story almost perfectly. So Q, which I talked about earlier, was the number of seats on the flight that he has to sell. T is the time between when the bookings open and the actual date of the flight, which is between which the airline has to sell as many of the tickets as it can for as much money. Now, QI is the number of seats needed by buyer I. You can think of like a family of 4 wanting to buy tickets in a group. If a family of 4 gets 3 tickets, it's reasonable to assume that they're not too happy about that. People will argue about this, but the point is we restricted attention to a monopolist, which is kind of standard. So there is no outside option for the buyers. So if they get 3 tickets, they only get 3 tickets, and that's useless for them. Entry time is when the buyer first learns he must fly. So, think about it's a certain point in time when you suddenly realize you want to be elsewhere. Like I only knew last week that I needed to be here. So I obviously would not book tickets to Seattle in advance of knowing that I needed to come to Seattle. And exit times are the latest time by which I must know whether I got the ticket or not. So
the last assumption is actually not quite true for people who fly a lot. Sometimes buy sort of, for example, people who fly a lot to Europe often buy tickets to roll them one into another. But it's most of the time true. The kind of logic of the thing being that I might want to know 2 months in advance because I have to book hotels or take time off work, or the usual kind of story can be spun around it. And if you don't like the assumption, you can just set people's exit times to the last time period, by which time they have to know whether they're flying or not. That's fairly reasonable. So just having explained this to you, I just wanted to go over kind of the prior work of that. Our paper kind of goes over 2 bits. One is it obviously contributes to this business of mechanism design in dynamic settings. And B, we also believe we've made some contribution to to auction design in multidimensional types. So we'll go over what happens in dynamic settings first. So Volcano, Van Ryzen, and Maglaras published a paper in Operations Research a couple of years back, where they basically study a case where each agent wants only 1 ticket, 1 unit, and each agent has his entry time set to the same as his exit time. So there are T time periods, but if an agent arrives in period 3, he also has to exit in period 3. What this means is that buyers can't strategize over time or quantity. They want only 1 unit, so that's not an option, and they can't misreport their times. In that sense, this is it's not a fully multidimensional setting. There is only one true private information for the bidders here, which is their valuation. Lavi and Nissan have pretty much the same model as above. This is their online auctions. And what they do instead is that they don't make any distributional assumptions. So with this lack of distributional assumptions, instead they propose a mechanism and they do kind of standard online algorithm worst case analysis. Parks, Margot Seltzer, and Chaki Ng do a slightly different thing where they're trying to auction Wi-Fi spots at a Starbucks. So in each period there are Q units, but they're renewable over time. And they each person wants only 1 unit because he just wants 1 connection to the Wi-Fi space. TI and TI bar are private. Valuation is private, but they're not always able to guarantee. They're not always able to guarantee that people will be truthful with respect to their times. So they assume that people don't misreport times, only that they have private information regarding these times. So that's a bit.
Bode and Gallian are looking at a more classical, looking at this from a classical economic sense, where they're looking at, instead of an auctioning mechanism, they're looking at a pricing mechanism. So they're studying prices over time. In terms of our model, in their models, they're looking at monopolists who have unlimited supply, who can supply unlimited quantities potentially, but set prices over time. And they have infinite horizon models. Each agent wants only one unit. The important thing about their assumptions is that the time sensitivity of the agent enters through a discount rate. So if the agent enters in a certain period and he delays his decision by one period, then he gets only some delta less than 1 times his true utility. The discount rate basically captures his time sensitivity. The point is that the discount rate, in their papers, discount rate is the same across agents, and it's common knowledge. So again, this is, make what you will of this. They get very similar results, but we're going to. Now, like I said, that was kind of a summary of what happens in dynamic settings. There's also been a large body of literature in economics of optimal auctions. The standard canonical setting and the celebrated paper was by Roger Myerson in '82. And he basically showed how to compute the revenue maximizing auction when all types are one-dimensional. Putting it in terms of our model, each agent wants 1 unit. There is 1 unit of the good to be sold. Private values are valuations are private information, and there is only 1 time period. So it's the standard classical, the classical auction, if you will. Now, his basic idea was the following. If agents were incapable of lying, if they had to report their true value, then what you do is obvious. You just allot the good to the person with the highest valuation, and you take his valuation, you take his utility from him. To make it incentive compatible, what he suggested was instead of the valuation that the agent reports, there's a transformation to a virtual value. So he specifies a function, I'll get around to that in a second, where he says, just run your preferred optimization algorithm. In this case, for this setting, it would be just the Wickery auction, with the virtual values rather than the actual values.
Is it the same function for all of them?
It's the same function, yes. I'll just specify that function in a second. But the idea is that this incentive compatibility rent is the kind of what you have to pay out to capture incentive compatibility is captured by this transformation of types. And he showed that this was basically the ex ante, this was the maximum expected utility a auctioneer could hope for in these settings. So, since this is kind of critical, we're just going to go over this slowly. If you want me to speed up or slow down, just let me know. So we're going to do, Myerson did this with a continuum of types, but we're going to do this with a discrete type space, simply because it makes a few things easier. So let V equal to 1 through V bar be the set of types, where 1, 2, and all these numbers are potentially the valuation of the agent. And let F be the distribution over these types. So each agent gets an identical independent draw from this distribution F. We assume that this prior distribution over types has a monotone hazard rate. So the monotone hazard rate condition comes from testing theory. It simply says this condition over here, which you can see. That
a lot of us are not so, well, I'm not so familiar with this. So what is this monotone hazard rate?
So monotone hazard rate says that F of...
Yeah, but I'm just wondering why it's called the monotone hazard rate.
Why is it called the monotone hazard rate? So think of a bulb. Okay, think of it failing over, at each time period it has a probability of failing. The fact that this is increasing in V suggests that conditional on it not having failed, the probability of it failing in the current period is increasing as the time periods go through. So that's kind of a canonical assumption for testing. And if your question is whether this, since I might as well answer it, this F is, it's not a very restrictive assumption. log concavity implies monotone hazard rate, and most normal distributions you can think about, the normal distribution, the uniform distribution, all these distributions meet the monotone hazard rate condition.
Now, while this makes sort of a lot of sense for light bulbs, I don't quite see why it makes sense for types.
Okay, I'll tell you so intuitively I'll tell you why it makes sense for types, and mathematically I'll tell you why it makes sense for types a little later. The idea of having a monotone hazard rate simply says that if a low agent, let's suppose some guy with a low, some person with a low type reports, somebody reports a low type. Intuitively it says that there are enough high types afterwards. I don't know if you're... Tell you what, I'll get back to that question a little later. When you can see why it works mathematically, and I'll address that in a bit. So the direct revelation mechanism we're looking at is simply is that the seller announces A subscript V as the expected allocation of each type V. So he tells the bidders that if you report type V, you will get this expected allocation. If you report type V, this is the expected payment you will have to make. And we assume that an agent of type V gets utility V times A minus P. So he is risk neutral and he has quasi-linear preferences. So he can separate his allocation from his price, from the money he pays. Is that fine? All right. So there are two incentive compatibility constraints that we need to take care of. One is we need to take care of the fact that an agent of type V should not have any incentive to report, should weakly prefer to report his true type than a higher type. So if I'm type 3, I should have no incentive to report type 5 or type 4. On the other hand, if I have valuation 3, I should also have no incentive to report valuations of 2 or 1. So this is captured in these two incentive constraints, the upward and the downward. And the participation constraint is simply that his expected utility from reporting his true type must be greater than or equal to 0. All right. The optimal auction simply is in this case a linear program that maximizes over the allocation in the payment rules the expected revenue, subject to incentive constraints, participation, and feasibility. Feasibility seems to have fallen off the bottom of the slide, but it's hard to design infeasible.
So I'm confused by these two constraints, and if you interchange V and V prime,
yes,
won't they contradict each other?
I found one.
Is there?
No.
I thought there is a V prime mixed with V. That side it's not.
So here, see, this is the allocation of, this is the utility of an agent V from announcing V, right? This is the agent, his true type is V, but he announces V prime, where V prime is greater than V. And the incentive constraint says that he does.
Yes.
In this case,
Well, wait, let him go through it. Let him go through it.
here V prime, here the agent's true type is V prime. Here the agent's true type is V prime, because I just wanted to maintain V prime greater than V. In both cases, I figured that might be easier. Here V prime is, so this is the expected utility of an agent who is of type V prime and announces type V prime. And this is the expected utility if he is of type V prime, but announces V less than V prime. So they don't contradict each other. Mm-hmm. And
Yeah, I think what was confusing was, for a couple of us, was that we thought that V or V prime, that what the agent is changes in each case.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Yeah. It's just that, but I think that was why a few of us were puzzled.
Is it?
No, but mathematically, see, if V prime is strictly larger than V,
yes,
then the right-hand side of the bottom is strictly larger then the left-hand side on the top.
Yes, probably, but
Fine, and
No,
that's
it's fine.
fine.
It's okay. Yes.
Yeah.
okay. Is it all? It's all good.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Paying attention.
Awesome. I love that. I was hoping you weren't. Makes presentations easier. So here's kind of here's how you solve the optimal auction in this case. And so first, fix an allocation rule. Okay, just any feasible allocation rule. The goal is and try to find an incentive compatible pricing scheme. Okay, so the goal is that is basically captures the top inequality, captures the inequalities that the prices have to that the price rule that you define has to meet. So we're going to try and do a graph theoretic representation, which comes from the dual of the linear program I showed you in the last slide. So introduce a vertex for each type V. All right. Introduce a dummy vertex or a type 0 to account for participation constraints. I've just thrown in another type 0 who basically always reports 0, always gets 0 allocation, and always pays 0. So he's just a superfluous type thrown in. And for each pair, introduce an edge of this length. Okay, this pair V prime to V corresponds to the incentive constraint that V should not misreport as V prime. So edges go in the opposite direction. Okay, it's you can very quickly show that PV is bounded above by length of shortest path from 0 to V. Okay, from this dummy type, the graph is clearly connected and complete actually. So, and shortest paths will exist if and only if there are no negative cycles. So a startup sufficient condition would be that there are no negative cycles. You can show, and if A is monotone in types, which means higher types get more have a higher probability of getting the good, then there are no negative length cycles. Okay? And also, monotone A implies that the non-adjacent incentive constraints are redundant. So an adjacent incentive constraint is type V reporting type V, to disincentivize him from reporting V plus 1 or V minus 1. A non-adjacent incentive constraint is V to V plus 2 or V plus 3 or whatever. So monotone A implies non-adjacent incentive constraints are redundant. This simply comes from the increase. You don't even need the linear form. Any utility function that meets increasing differences will do the trick. And if A is monotone, then the only shortest path rooted at 0 is simply 1. That should be 2. So it's 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3 to the type. All right? So what this will allow you to do is simply write PV as a linear function of A. And this,
The other kind of way, yeah.
no, it'll be 0 to 1. 1
Whatever.
Yeah. All right. And this will basically let you do the following, which is simply write the price as a linear function of the allocations. So further, it actually does a little more. It says that my price depends only on my allocation and the allocations of types less than me. It doesn't depend on the allocations of types more than me. And this reduces. So now we have, if you restrict your attention to monotone incentive constraints, then monotone allocation rules, then you have an optimization problem in just A. Now the point you'll notice is if you go back to these downward and upward incentive constraints, combine these two, and you will notice that the allocation rule has to be monotone. So the only feasible rules are monotone allocation rules. Mm-hmm. All right, so now we have now we can quickly crunch through.
Explains why you kept V prime bigger than V.
Yeah. And that will quickly solve Meyerson's problem. The trouble is that once we move into multidimensional cases, firstly, it's reasonably well known that multidimensional mechanism design is hard. And I don't mean hard in any computer science sense. It just means hard to prove theorems about Though I think there is one paper by Amin Saberi and someone that shows that it's also hard in the computer science sense. And the intuitive problem is that there are too many IC constraints. You know, if you want to incentivize people to not misreport in multiple dimensions, then you simply have, I'll just leave it at that. You simply have too many incentive constraints. So knowing that A is incentive compatible, knowing that A is monotone, is no longer sufficient to pin down a shortest path tree. And if I want to compute a price function, I need to characterize the shortest path tree, because the shortest path tree is the dual of the optimization program I set out with. So if I can't characterize the shortest path tree, I can't give you theorems about what the optimal auction should look like. Is this all making sense? All right. So what we're doing here in this setting is we're saying we're getting around this problem because agents can misreport Qi, Ti, and Ti bar in only one direction. They can't, because of the setting we're in, they can't misreport it in the other direction. We don't have to look at incentive constraints corresponding to that. So an agent can only overreport the quantity he wants. He can't underreport the quantity he wants. He can only pretend to arrive after his true arrival time, not before. And he can only exit the system before his true exit time, not after. So this basically is, removes a lot of incentive constraints, and again makes the problem tractable. The catch is that we can't restrict attention to monotone A's. I should just clarify one thing here, which is that now we have this four-dimensional type, and I define a partial order on these, which is the So I say that this type partial. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you guys? So I say that an agent is partial. Can you guys see it? Yeah. An agent of this type is, partially ordered above an agent of this type if he has a higher valuation, wants fewer units, arrives earlier and leaves later, which is kind of intuitively, the better type for.
Over Q rather than P, because then he's willing to pay more per unit.
So, this is it's just a definition. It's the one that works. Having said that, there's nothing sacrosanct about this definition. This was just made because this was just made to clarify ideas. There is absolutely nothing sacrosanct. I'll get around to why that won't work exactly in a bit. If you want intuition right now, the idea is we're running a discrete knapsack later, so you can't sort agents by that. Yeah.
So the point is that one of these agents can lie and be the other one.
Pardon me?
One of these agents can lie and be the other one.
Exactly. So this agent can always lie to be this type, but this type cannot lie back to be this one. The ability to lie also goes with the partial order. Right?
And you've put the restrictions on that only allow one-way lie.
Yeah, that only allow.
That truthfulness is consistent with your partial.
Yeah.
That's if and only if.
I don't.
The person can lie if and only if they're partial of.
No, that's not true. The idea being that this valuation is unconstrained, right? You can.
Oh, sorry, right.
So it's almost, it works in one direction, it just doesn't work in the other. You can always underreport your valuation and keep everything else the same. And you can. All right. So what I want to convince you is that what happens because of this is that I no longer get what I did with Myosin. I don't, because I have this one direction of lying, I can't restrict attention to monotone A's. And the whole point of, the contribution of this paper in that direction has simply been to show that, yes, it is enough to restrict attention to monotone A's, a particular monotone A because, intuitively the polytope, it's the right corner point of the polytope of the linear program. So. But here's an example of...
That's a contribution
of the Myers.
Of us. Restricting that you can, even in these partial... Intuitively, I'll just quickly tell you why this one direction of lying can break things down. Why you need not get a monotone rule. So consider a single object auction and there are only two types. A high valuation bidder and a low valuation bidder. Buyers cannot exaggerate their value, so buyers can only lie down. So this is similar to the kind of restrictions we place here. So if a buyer of type high can report low or high, a buyer of type low can only report low. Okay? Consider an allocation rule where L gets the object and type H never gets the object. Okay? It's a funny rule, but I'll tell you why it might work. I give L the object, and I pay H to compensate him for that. For the fact that so I take all of L's surplus. Okay? I give L the object and I say, okay, pay me everything that you value on the object. And I tell H, I'm going to pay you something. So I'm not going to extract any payment from him. I'm going to give him some payment and say, if you type H, just take this money and leave. Okay? Now think of a case in which low types are very high probability and high types are very low probability. Okay? Just intuitively. Well, you could do better because low types are so rare that you can just give them high types are low probability. High types are very low probability. Right. So you can just, you can make him that payment, and in expectation that isn't hurting you. But the low type is getting the object and giving you all the valuation he has, and he happens very often. So you can't do this.
And actually, it happens a lot with fixed prices, that the prices are set low enough that the buyer
exactly
that the vast majority of the people buy the object, right?
Exactly. So note that, however, if we allowed buyers to exaggerate their types, then the low type would say, aha, the high type is getting a payment for nothing. So the low type would then, this auction would not be incentive compatible if the low type could also pretend to be the high type. So that's kind of the important point, that if you remove this one direction of lying, then you can design these kind of ugly schemes. The point of our paper is that if the monotone hazard rate condition holds, there exists an optimal auction, an optimal allocation rule, and an optimal pricing rule, so that A is monotone. All right? Yeah.
So does the monotone hazard rate imply that it cannot be the case that the low type has a very high probability and high type has?
Yeah, that's.
So it sort of takes care of.
Yeah, the monotone hazard rate is picking up exactly that. I should have pointed that out. Thanks. That there are enough high types for me not to want to pull out a scheme like this out of my bag. Yeah.
Do you know anything about this? If the monotone hazard rate is not hold?
So, okay, I can give you a couple of answers. One is, if, let's suppose, both directions of lying were in place. Okay?
Actually, I only care about the case where you can only lie in one direction.
Oh, you only care about that case? No, I have, we're looking for results. So, just moving back to Meyerson for a second, since I'll answer what I can. What Meyerson does is he says, suppose monotone hazard rate does not hold, then I can basically iron the probability distributions so that it and then work with those iron probability distributions so that in fact it's still optimal. And because in Meyerson we have, since both directions of lying are possible in Meyerson, we have to restrict attention to these monotone schemes. You need to work that out. You need to do this ironing procedure, which is complicated, but it's intuitive. In this, it's not clear what will happen if the monotone hazard rate doesn't hold. It's we don't know the answer yet. The only saving grace we can offer is that the monotone hazard rate is not a particularly biting. It's not a very biting restriction. It simply says that, most good distributions you can think up are satisfy this monotone hazard rate condition. So that's all I'll offer for now. Yes?
There's another case, to go back to your airline example.
Yeah.
I would call it a blended type, where I might be willing to buy 3 seats, but only if they're together. So if you have a condition that you placed on this, you actually have a blended type. The same buyer, but I'm simultaneously H and L.
I didn't understand.
I'm purchasing conditioned upon. I will pay less if I can have 3 seats on the plane. I will pay more if all 3 of them are together.
Okay, so currently, I mean, when I set up this model, I said that these types are the Q units that I'm trying to sell are indistinguishable from each other. Okay, what you're talking about are each seat has a particular connotation. It has a seat number, so it's a distinguishable object from another seat. And you don't care which seat you get, but you'd like 3 seats together, right?
That's a different case, right?
Yeah.
What you just said is different.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is I'm considering the case where the Q units the monopolist is trying to sell are indistinguishable. If I give you any 3, you can't tell the difference. So it's kind of outside the model. You're right, it might be interesting, but the trouble is that once you go into these distinguishable good cases, then these things get very hairy very fast. And traditionally, we've solved these problems by sweeping them under the carpet and pretending they don't exist. So that's
letting the families ask each other.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you get on the plane and then you ask somebody to move. It works out more often than not.
I'm using that as a proxy for a more interesting problem, of course.
It
would be hard for the Wi-Fi radio to have a conversation with another Wi-Fi radio about this subject. But it's okay. Never mind.
Anything else? No. All right. So here was I should have pointed this out earlier, but I will do this now because I'm going the wrong way. So for the one-dimensional case, the virtual value of a type V just turns out to be this. His true value minus the inverse of his hazard rate. So the idea in Meyerson's auction is simply take these virtual values instead of the true values and run Vickrey with these values. So in particular, in the one-dimensional setting, what happens is some people's values will go negative, right? So you just will not allot. Like if you get a profile of where everyone has low types, you will not allot anybody in those things. The idea is that you will not allot to people with negative virtual values. And the intuition for that is when I allot somebody lower, I have to pay incentive rents to higher ups. So if the type is too low, then the amount of money I'm actually getting for him does not compensate the amount of incentive rent I have to pay forward. And that's the idea behind this virtual valuation. Now it's simple in Meyerson because he has one unit. He just has to. It's just it's the quickest thing. If there is somebody above the virtual valuation in a given profile, you give it to the highest virtual valuation. If it's not, then you don't. You can also see why the monotone hazard rate works mathematically, because then what this says is this will be ordered the same as the V's, right? So if this is ordered in the same way as the V's, I'm just allotting the highest true type up to a reserve price. And that's what, and then when people, when Meyerson kind of deconstructed after his proof, he realized that what he's basically saying is that the optimal auction for the one good private values case is Vickrey with the reserve value. That's the best you can do. So you set the right reserve value, you set the right Vickrey auction, and then you just do a Vickrey auction. Vickrey auctions are, of course, highest bidder gets the good, second highest pays the second highest guy's price. All right. Ours turns out to be basically very similar looking. It's where these Fs are conditioned upon the rest of his type. So it's f of vi conditioned upon the fact that he requires qi and he comes in at ti and leaves at super ti. So that's the virtual value. And our claim is, our major result is to say that the optimal allocation rule with this is to run a dynamic knapsack. So a dynamic knapsack is you have queue periods, you have to fill in. Buyers are arriving over time. You know the distribution of buyers, so you know that NT buyers will arrive in each period. NT is a random number. And you're basically trading off how much you're allotting now with people later, and you're running a knapsack in each period on top of that. So it's computationally, I would be the first to admit that this is hard. Yes?
So I'm just trying to clarify if this is more general than what you're saying. Suppose we forget the meanings of P and Q.
Yes.
Does this hold for multi-dimensional types in general, where one of them is the value, the other is just affect the distribution, but you only allow one-sided deviations on the rest of them?
So the qualified answer is that it could, but you have to work through it. I mean, I can't say it generally. Okay, here's why. QI places certain restrictions on the utility function, but it doesn't. They're not generic restrictions on the utility function. QI says that the utility is a step function of the quantity you get, right? That at QI you'll suddenly get a jump. Okay, that's a non-generic restriction on the utility function, in the sense that if a person's utility function is something different to that, then it might behave differently under these circumstances. Similarly, the Ti and the Ti bar, you are right to say you could forget them, but the point is I'm making certain other assumptions, kind of subtle assumptions, which is to say that they also place restrictions on the allocation rules I can use. My allocation rules have to be measurable with respect to each. The allocation of a person who exits at a certain period has to be measurable with respect to profiles up to that period. It can't depend on people who come later. Our algorithm can't look into the future. The allocation, yeah, clearly. So these restrictions are non-generic, and the method might work. We're hoping it's general, but we haven't tested it for other multidimensional models yet.
So you're saying the proof that this technique works uses the feasible region?
Yes. It's basically a proof based on saying, look at the feasible region, look at this point that I'd like you to see. So the idea of the proof is pick the allocation rule that meets the dynamic knapsack with respect to these virtual values. Aha, look, it works. So it's a bit of a reverse engineered proof, but you get what you ask for. Anyone? Okay. Now, what turns out is that this, if you assume the monotone hazard rate as before, a monotone hazard rate on this thing now, yeah, and you assume, no, you don't need to assume anything else. It turns out that the pricing is a linear function of the allocation rule, because what happens is the allocation rule is isotonic with respect to this partial ordering. Okay, and there's still a caveat, but I will come back to that later. So the pricing rule the pricing rule is now a linear function of the allocation rule, and it's just the same as Bayesian previously. It says that the price you pay depends on your allocation and the allocation of people below you. People below you on the same slice. So people below you who also want QI, TI, and who also want QI units and enter at TI and leave at TI bar. So that's the pricing rule. Note that if we look at allocation rules that are non-monotonic, then all hell breaks loose, because I can't reduce the number of incentive compatibility conditions sufficiently to pin down the shortest path. Under the assumption of allocation rules that are monotonic, I have pinned down the shortest path on this lattice. So that's that. And given that the allocation rule is monotonic, this mechanism maximizes expected revenue. The appendix will hopefully tell you that the allocation rule should be monotonic, or rather this monotonic allocation rule is the right one to look at. So it goes both ways. Okay? Is everyone clear about? Awesome. Okay. Now time for the embarrassing little caveat. It's not that bad. I cannot guarantee that it will be monotonic just with respect to this T bar, the exit time. Okay? The trouble is that if it is not monotonic with respect to exit time, then since I've given a pricing rule that assumes monotonicity with respect to exit time, it could cause, the mechanism need not be incentive compatible. So there are multiple options out. The one that works, the easy one is simply to say, run the allocation rule first, run the dynamic knapsack algorithm first, and check if the allocation rule for this particular distribution is monotonic. And if it is, then it works through. I can also give you weaker sufficient conditions on the allocation rule. Monotonicity is not necessary for me to pin down these shortest path. I can live with something weaker. So you can just test with respect to that, and it's sufficient.
But it's uglier to state.
Pardon me? It's just a statement I didn't want to write down. It's a simple inequality. It's a simple sequence of inequalities, linear inequalities. It's nothing. There's no rocket science. But on the other hand, what we can also do is just constrain ourselves to search within the space of monotonic allocation rules. Okay? But then I cannot guarantee that we've achieved the optimal expected revenue. There might be some small loss. I also have no bounds on how much loss there might be. So just concluding, we've extended the optimal mechanism design to fully dynamic settings. Like I said earlier, most papers before have kind of not really encapsulated the full dynamic nature, which is that people can actually lie about their time as well, and their time constraints are also private information rather than common knowledge or public information. And we've also provided another example for Meyerson's virtual utility hypothesis, the whole business of the virtual valuation, just the idea that optimal mechanism design, the best way to do it is to find the correct virtual value and run your favorite optimization algorithm for that type with the virtual value rather than the reported value.
Now, could this still be interpreted as some kind of reserve price, or some series of reserve prices, or not?
Yes, you can interpret it as a series of reserve prices for each, in the sense that I will not allot to anyone with the negative virtual value. So it's just a series of reserve prices, one for each QI, TI, and TI bar. But
I guess that's a lot.
That's a lot of reserve prices.
That's a lot of reserve prices.
It can.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense as a reserve price.
It's a knapsack algorithm, which that's why it's a knapsack algorithm, which is why I can't sort. I don't want to use a sorting on V by Q, because someone could have a very high valuation but also want a lot of units, and I might not just want to give away that unit, and then that partial order would have made me. Yeah.
If you had different distributions for different people, can you rephrase? So you can certainly write the virtual valuations in terms of these different distributions.
Yes.
F sub I for the ith person. So
yes.
Does the whole thing still work?
So I know it works for Meyerson's case. I know it works for Meyerson's case in the following sense. It works for Meyerson's case because if each agent has a different type, then I just set a different reserve for each agent. So my rule is now no longer anonymous. Agent 1 is not treated the same as agent 2. Here, agents, remember that each agent at a different quantity and a different time of exit has a different distribution over its valuations. So in that sense, I have allowed, but I'm not looking at non-anonymous schemes where different agents have, and that the agent name impacts the distribution. That I don't assume ex ante that agent 1's valuations are different from agent 2's valuations, come from a different distribution to agent 2's valuations. That I don't look at that.
Do you think that your analysis would work out fine if you had these different distributions?
I don't see why not, but I wouldn't risk my life on it. But I think it should go through pretty easily.
Do you know what airlines actually do?
Pardon me? So I know what airlines actually do, roughly speaking, which is they set a price in a period and they set a booking quota for a period. That's actually what hotels do. I'm sure something similar is what airlines are using. Well, okay, let me restate. So hotels, which have a very similar problem, use exactly what I just said. They set a booking quota for each period. So they say that in this month I will book out so many things for so many, for the month I have reservations for this day, I will book out so many 2 months in advance. and then they set a price, depending on a few parameters. Airlines, I think, have started to...
Do they vary then that price?
They vary that price, yes, they do. Basically, they look to...
So they lower it until they sell that much?
Yeah, something like that is what they use. I mean, it's pretty... I mean, the deal is that airlines and hotels look to hide away their pricing schemes. At least to the best of my knowledge, it isn't in the public domain, what they're using in real life, because they don't like it much. Yeah.
I believe the two airlines that make money in the U.S. have everything open. That's JetBlue and Southwest. The ones that play games lose money.
Yeah, sure. That's true. But, I mean, I know that, for instance, American and United spend billions of dollars looking for better pricing schemes, complicated...
Chapter 10.99.
Yeah.
Their pricing discrimination schemes that stretch all the way back to the railroads, though. I mean, in an optimization scheme like this goes towards that. What I think you will find, though, when you look at these, is that the price discrimination schemes may, in practice, actually be better than this, may be more optimal for certain selected cases. And what I'm wondering is what the other effects are, such as we're talking about the double constraints of I'll buy them and I'll pay more only if they're together, or the airline's ability to oversell the airline. They will sell it over by 10% and not give you a seat number. So when you show up, you're actually competing for a falsely scarce resource.
So I'll tell you what the most non-realistic assumption here is. The most non-realistic assumption here is the fact that we can look at direct revelation mechanisms, right? So what I've said is that an agent, I've said that an agent knows, so if you're going to China in a month, you know that in exactly 2 weeks, on March 29th, or, March 29th, you have to know. 30th will not do. That's a weird assumption, right? It's good for, it's a very good theoretical assumption, but it doesn't translate too directly. And the other thing is that I can, actually, if you wanted to think about how to implement this, maybe you could use this. You could use that kind of ambiguity in your favor, right? The other thing, of course, being that, I don't think any airline auction pricing site is going to suddenly say, oh, just give us all 4 and we'll give you an expected allocation and a pricing rule. So that's not about to happen. Yeah.
So the model that's very similar to yours that people have thought about is when the end time isn't actually known in advance, the person just leaves at some point. So they'll hang out with a bid submitted, and at some point they just withdraw it. And it seems that if this was the case, then your allocation procedure would have to be monitored, and there wouldn't be this extra parameter. And then you should be all set. Is that true?
So the deal is, how would you... So if you want to model it in the following way, that an agent just comes in with an entry time, a quantity, and a valuation, and then at some time he just gets an exogenous signal that says leave. And if that's your modeling, then yes, then that's perfect for me. That's just, then my answer is like no caveat, the perfect solution. Okay, but the question is, you have to answer, before that, you have to tell me where are these exit times coming from. If the exit time is just coming to the agent at a certain time, and he's saying, okay, I have to leave, at a certain point, an agent suddenly says, oh, I have to leave the system and withdraw my bid, and he can't wait any longer. That's perfect for me. If an agent gets, he gets a 3-period window, for instance. If he gets a signal saying, oh, you have to leave in the next 3 time periods. Pick your preferred time period. Then I still have the same problems as before. And then this is just as good a solution as, just assuming that he knew it in advance is as good, because I can't give you any ex-ante theoretical bounds on, the difference between the ability to lie about your exit time completely and the ability to lie about it only 3 periods. So does that answer your question, or have I lost you? Okay. Anything else?
Okay, thank you again.
All right.